I am with Equity Institute in Brazil and also the Brazilian Network on People's Integration. It's a network of social movements, trade unions, and NGOs that has been, over the last 10 years, mobilizing against free trade agreements, especially within the World Trade Organization, but also the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas that we part of several coalitions. We are also following very closely Brazilian foreign policies in different issues, so including financial issues and the G20 agenda and the BRICS. The global crisis is a crisis of the capitalist system. It's not like we can avoid. Countries are in different situations in relation to this crisis, but it's a crisis that comes also very strongly from the capture of transnational corporations of our economy. More and more transnational corporations are powerful and are capturing governments' decision-making processes. We're seeing this everywhere, like in Greece, where the government was changed to technocrats so that the financial markets would be more at ease. Or we see these in other areas like in Paraguay, a neighbor country of Brazil, where the coup d'etat was highly in the interest of Monsanto and Cargill, two big transnational corporations of agribusiness. So the crisis is actually very linked to the fact that transnational corporations more and more are capturing the power of our governments in their own favor. So it's not even possible, it's not actually possible to avoid it if we don't dismantle that power, the corporate power of transnationals. Neoliberalism has been very strong for the past 40 years. Maybe we can say it has been defeated completely, but it's definitely an ideological crisis. It's harder and harder for its defendants to be strong about why we should keep on track of neoliberalism. And this is still very strong ideology. Like, people still think that privatizing, giving power to the market is the way to go and to manage economies. So in that sense, it's an ideological crisis because the global crisis have shown it has several limits, but we still have to win the ideological battle to show that neoliberalism is not the way to go. In Brazil and in several countries in South America that have more progressive governments, we have had a few changes in that respect. So we don't have the same situation that we had in the 90s, where most of these countries had strong neoliberal governments, but still the current governments are still facing a correlation of forces within the country that sometimes they favor the elites, while at the same time they do policies that favor populations. So we have to overcome that and really have processes that are for the peoples, for the poor, for the middle classes to emerge. So in that sense, we have a lot to struggle for, even in a region like in South America, where several countries are more and more progressive than in the past. But we are still doing, on the outside, our governments are oftentimes promoting our transnational corporations in other continents. So sometimes what you defend for your country at the global level is not necessarily what you do in other regions towards other countries. We have still to fight that and change the way things are done. Like, the alternative to that is something that is on the making. Social movements have been engaging in several processes of dialogue on denouncing the existing global economic system for all of its problems, and also what we want to see in place. There are several alternatives that have been built in this dialogue. For instance, food sovereignty as a framework for the agriculture model that we want to see in place. But in general, what we want is to have a system that serves people, that protects the commons, and it's for economic and social justice, where markets and transnational corporations are not the most powerful forces in the economy. So Brazil, as other so-called emergent economies, had a different impact of the crisis than it happened, for instance, in Southern Europe or in the US. And a lot of that resulted in all of these talks that maybe the BRICS are in a different situation. They have been decoupling their economies from the North. We know there is a lot of limits to that. For instance, a lot of our good response, between quotes, to the crisis comes from the fact that China remained for a long time demanding commodities that Brazil produced in large scale. So we were counting on that demand to continue to grow for a while, and also on our national demand. But the government also made very strong policies, like investing in the economy so that it would continue to grow. Plus, the cash transfer policies for poorer population had risen, like the amount of demand that the population had in general. So the economy, like the national economy, could count on that increase in the national demand. But still, we can say that we have actually avoided the crisis. Brazil have had very minimum growth in some periods since the crisis had started, and we are still connected. Our economy is relating to other economies. That's what globalization does to you. So in order to really change the perspectives of the crisis for the country in the future, we really have to fight for systemic change, because we're not going to be like an island, isolated. And at the same time, I think countries like Brazil have a big role to play in regional integration processes. For social movements in Brazil, we feel that our country should lead a regional integration process that really potentialize the processes in Latin America in general. We have a big role to play in that sense for a progressive agenda in the region to continue to be deepening and deepening on the way forward. For us in Brazil, and REBRIP has been a very strong part of this process. The WTO has never been something that we see as positive. Unfortunately, Brazil was there from the start, always involved in these multilateral negotiations before in the GATT and after the WTO was created. And this has created a lot of problems for us, and we have been mobilizing against it since its inception in 1995. So it's just a pity that Russia is accessing to it in a moment that actually we are already so convinced already that it shouldn't be the way. And WTO is actually in a very big deadlock, because they haven't managed to really succeed in moving forward with the agenda, which partially is a result of our success as social movements to mobilizing and showing that the neoliberal agenda of the WTO is a failure. But on the other hand, bilateral investment, bilateral trade agreements, and multilateral trade agreements continue to be signed everywhere. So the battle is not done. We're not in a victory there. We still have to continue mobilizing against processes that are happening everywhere. So I would say, no, Russia shouldn't be in the WTO, none of us. The WTO should be out of the map, and we should rethink our trade regime to something that is really for development and for the protection of people's rights and human rights.